Good morning, Bear Valley family. I'm so glad to be with you today. I am grateful that you have taken this time to come together and be with us. So we are broadcasting, streaming from a rather empty auditorium. It's really quiet around here these days. Kind of creepy, if you want to be truthful about it. But you know, I've been contemplating this week that there's light at the end of the tunnel. Things around the state of Colorado, around the country, are beginning to open up a little bit at a time. People are moving about a little more than they were even 2 weeks ago. And so it's one of those where we see the light at the end of the tunnel. And with that said, because we can kind of see an end coming, what that means for us is that someday, sometime soon, hopefully sooner rather than later, we are all going to be back here in this auditorium again, spending this time of worship face to face instead of having to rely on the digital feed. Now, I don't know exactly when that is going to be. I know we have our target dates, but that's all they are, our target dates. We kind of have to play this week after week. But one of the things that occurs to me as I think about these target dates, as I think about the idea of coming back, I'm going to venture a guess that a lot of you are a bit like me in that we're beginning to wonder, what's that going to be like? What is it going to be like when we get back into this building after having not been here for 3+ months? And a lot of people across the nation are actually trying to figure that out. I actually read in a church blog, it's actually been a couple of months ago. The guy wrote, he made the comment, he said, we're all startup congregations now. And I kind of understand what he means. It feels that way. We've been apart for so long that it feels like we're going to need to do a certain amount of rebuilding whenever we do come back together. And when I think about that idea of rebuilding a work, rebuilding a congregation, rebuilding a community, it leads me to wonder a couple of questions. When we consider the idea of coming back to Bear Valley, is it reasonable for us to think that things are going to go on and life is going to resume exactly the way it was before? Or do we need to consider how things might be different when we come back? Whether that's temporary or maybe you may see some long-term differences. To be sure, this is just another thing to add to the list of uncertainties that we face right now. I get it. To pile these kinds of questions on, it just adds one more thing that we don't know. But as I ponder these questions, I am encouraged to realize that this is not the first time that people have faced the prospect of having to rebuild after crisis or after disaster. You look through human history, and there are countless times throughout human history in which people had to rebuild physically after natural disasters. They've had to rebuild spiritually after departing from God's ways for a period of time. They've had to rebuild emotionally after tragedy and crisis, and they've had to take the time to get back to that point of strength. Rebuilding is not something that's new to us as human beings. It's part of the human existence. And when I think about Scripture, I realize that there are points in Scripture in which we see rebuilding taking place. Perhaps one of the most pertinent examples comes to us from the books of Ezra and Nehemiah. In these historical books, sitting right at the tail end of the storyline of the Old Testament. You may have never realized that before, but Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, when you read through those 3 books, you have now completed the historical timeline of the Old Testament. These books give us a glimpse into the nature of a people rebuilding. And over the course of the next 3 or 4 weeks, we'll kind of see how this goes. But over the course of the next few weeks, we are going to look at these accounts, this story of Israel coming back from captivity, and try to draw out some principles that I think are going to be helpful for us, that help us understand or recognize some things that we may face as we begin to rebuild from this COVID crisis of 2020. Now, if you're not familiar with the storyline of Ezra and Nehemiah, you may be trying to figure out why these two books in particular. But before we draw any principles out of it, let me give you a little bit of a context. Let's take a minute and go through the idea of what this story is about. Now, you can see on the screen, I've got dates up there. I'm one of those geeky guys. I really like to see the dates. I like to put them in a timeline. You may not care about that. If not, that's fine. Just grab the details of the story along the way, the general idea of the story. What you find happening is when you open up the book of Ezra, which is where I would recommend if you're going to read it, you start at. If you open up the book of Ezra, you are looking at a time that is at the end of a 70-year exile, 7 decades that the people of Israel have been in exile in the land of Babylon. This you read about that exile at the end of 2 Kings. You read about it in the first little bit of the book of Daniel as those people were taken away by Nebuchadnezzar. Well, here we are in the book of Ezra, and we are 7 decades later. Things are beginning to change. The Babylonian Empire has fallen. The Persian Empire is coming into play. And in 539 BC, we have a king by the name of Cyrus the Great, a Persian king, who decides to take things a little differently than the Babylonians. The Babylonians always wanted to get loyalty and to try to tamp down rebellion by scattering people all over the known world. Cyrus was a different guy, had a different mentality. He operated from the idea that said, when he takes over, he let those captured peoples go home. And the idea was that if he became their redeemer, their savior, so to speak, if he let them go home, then they would be much more likely to be loyal to him. And so in 539 BC, what we find recorded for us in Ezra chapter 1 is that Cyrus lets these people begin to go home, and Israel was included in that. Ezra chapters 1 through 4 documents how an initial wave of Jewish people stepped out in faith, and they journeyed back to their native land of Israel to rebuild what had been destroyed decades earlier. They rebuilt the altar on the temple grounds, and they offered sacrifices. They began the process of rebuilding the temple to Yahweh God. However, one of the things that we do find in those first few chapters is that opposition from outsiders who had been living in the land for those 7 decades, opposition from those outsiders caused that construction to stop. They became afraid. They became worried about that opposition they were going to meet. And so they quit working on the temple. And for 10 years, for a decade, that temple project sat unfinished. In Ezra chapters 5 and 6, we have stated for us that the ministries of Haggai and Zechariah came into play. These two prophets come along, and effectively they said, look, you started this, get going, get this job done. And so it motivated the people to get back to work. And in 516 BC, that temple is finally completed, some 20 years or so after they had come home. In Ezra chapter 7, we find that nearly 60 years from that first wave of coming home, 60 years from the time they were first allowed to leave Babylon, Ezra the scribe leads another wave of people back to Israel. And his job seems to be to restore the proper observance of law with a people who had failed to keep the covenant with God earlier. That's why they had been sent into exile to begin with. And so his job is to come along and actually help restore that, which he does a very successful job of. And then from there we can shift into Nehemiah chapter 1. And in Nehemiah chapter 1, chapters 1 through 9, you have even 14 years after Ezra. Nehemiah is sent by the king from the capital of Susa. He's sent to come and be governor of this region. And Nehemiah's big claim to fame is that when he arrives, he understands already that the breaches in the walls of Jerusalem are still there. They haven't rebuilt the walls after Nebuchadnezzar's destruction of them 7 decades before, actually more than 7 decades at this point. And so his big claim to fame is that he spearheads the project, and with the confidence and faith in God that these people have, in 52 days, despite opposition from outsiders, they rebuild those walls, and the protection for Jerusalem is restored. And so one of the things that's actually rather interesting when you put the timeline together is that the books of Ezra and Nehemiah speak to us of a period of time that covers a little over 100 years of history. Now, we clearly are not dealing with a 100-year process of rebuilding, nor a 70-year exile. Although, I will admit, right now it feels like we've been in exile for 70 years. We're not dealing with that. However, I do still think that there is something to be gained, some very practical insights to be gained from what they faced in the rebuilding process that are going to also potentially be found by us when we start that process of rebuilding from this time of quarantine and this time of isolation. And so this morning, as in the time we have left, I want to give for you, without digging too deeply into the text this morning, I want to give you a couple of facts about the Jews' return from exile that I think have some level of application to us. And the first is this: not everyone came back from Babylon. If you were to look at Ezra chapter 2, verse 64, it tells us that in that initial wave, there were 42,360 people who returned. Now, that's a lot of people. I get it. But I want you to take that number and put it into perspective. In our immediate area, in this Denver metro area, the city of Littleton, Colorado, in 2018, registered a population of 48,007 people. Just not even quite 6,000 more than who returned. And that's just in Littleton. Furthermore, historians who go back and try to study population densities in ancient parts of the world, many historians think that in the first century, in the time that Jesus walked the earth, Jerusalem held a max capacity of 50,000 people. That's just in the city of Jerusalem in the first century. What we're talking about with that first wave of people who returned from Babylon, a little over 42,000. We're talking about that 42,000 going there in order to populate the entirety of that Palestine area, or a big chunk of that Palestine area. And when you think about it in those numbers, and you think about the fact that this was a group of people who spent 7 decades in another country, what it tells us is that a whole lot of the Jewish people stayed in Babylon. And instead of coming back to Palestine, they either stayed in Babylon or they dispersed throughout the rest of the known world. Now, you may wonder, why is that? Why did they choose to not return? So many of them, well, there are a lot of different reasons, I suppose, but a decent speculation is that, in short, they liked their life there. They had put down roots, and they enjoyed the life that they had. There was no command from God that I've been able to find for them to return. This was an open invitation. It was an opportunity. And yes, God had promised that He would bring a remnant back, but there was no stated command from God that they had to go home. In fact, if you go back and read the prophet Ezekiel, when they first came into Babylonian captivity, Ezekiel prophesied to these people's grandparents. He said, you need to put down roots in Babylon because you're going to be here for a long time. You're not coming home anytime soon. And it seems like they listened. And so what we find is that this remnant that returned, they were stepping out in faith. And part of what we can see that as being a step of faith is the fact that they were small in number, at least a relatively small number compared to the entire Jewish population that was in existence at that time. And so the first fact that I think is worth us noting is that when you see this group coming back in Ezra and Nehemiah, not everyone came back from Babylon. Second fact that I find is very interesting is that things were very different when they returned to Jerusalem compared to when they left. You see, I think most of us today, most modern people, we have a mental picture of what a Jewish society looks like. And particularly those of us who are students of the New Testament, we have an image of what Judaism looks like. And that image of Judaism mostly comes from our reading of the Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. However, if you look very closely at the Old Testament scriptures, one of the things that you're going to find is that the pre-exile Judah is vastly different from the post-exile Persian province that in history goes down as being called Yehud, what we would call Judah. In fact, if you look through the book of Kings, 1st and 2nd Kings, you'll find that the book of Kings describes Israel and Judah before the exile. They are two small, tiny royal states that in many, many ways were indistinguishable from their neighbors in language and culture and even religion, except for a few faithful kings who brought them back to Yahweh worship. After the exile, post-exile Yehud, what you find there is a combination of traits that created the first kingdom, the first political entity that we would think of as being Jewish. Those people that are committed to the Torah law, the law of Moses. The people of Yehud had been raised in Persian cities. They were born there. They had never even been to Palestine prior to this move. They were raised in those Persian cities. They were raised in that Persian culture. They were raised with that Persian education. And so therefore, the society that they built included many Persian and Babylonian elements that the pre-exile Judah just didn't have. Their style of government was different. Their social customs were different. And what you would even find is that their applications, some of their applications of Mosaic law were even a little different than what we see recorded for us before the exile. And the thing is that this was to be expected, again, because they had been away for so long. 7 decades is a long time. They'd been away for so long that there was no way that things were not going to be different in Israel when they came back. And so we have these two facts about the return, the post-exile return. Not everybody returned from Babylon, and things were very different in Jerusalem when they returned. So the question then is this: what do these two facts about the exiles' return and the exiles' efforts to rebuild, what does that have to do with our rebuilding process that's coming soon down the road? Well, I think first of all, I think it tells us that we need to be prepared that not everyone is going to be back when our doors initially open. I think that's just going to be a simple fact. Now, there are a lot of different reasons. I'm not telling you that to become discouraged. There are numerous reasons why I think this seems likely. So don't panic at the thought of me saying this. You know, for one, some of our members are going to be hesitant to come back immediately because of the continued concerns with the surrounding COVID-19. They are going to want to know that their risk of getting this disease is greatly, greatly minimized. And so they're going to be looking for different things that are going to help raise their confidence in this. And the truth is, this is a trend we're seeing not just in churches, we're seeing this all over our society right now. And for those folks that are at highest, those who are at highest risk are trying to be extra careful to maintain their health. And we appreciate that, and we understand that. And so for those of you who are watching, who are listening, know this, know that we here at Bear Valley, we are going to continue to do all that we can to meet your needs and to help you in any way we possibly can as you navigate through the lack of certainty regarding your health, and as you look for whatever it is you need to look for before you feel confident in returning to this building. We understand that that's the case. So there are going to be some who are not going to come back immediately because they just don't feel like they can do that safely yet. That being said, though, I think we need to also recognize, church, that we need to be prepared for the likelihood that some will not return when we first open our doors because they've become comfortable with their life away from the Grace community. Maybe this time of quarantine, it's been the change in habit, and they've gotten accustomed to the change in habit, or perhaps there are other struggles that they were already having that have been intensified in this time away, and they simply choose not to return. How should we respond to that? I think we need to encourage these folks as well. Not with oppressive guilt trips and arm twisting, strong arm tactics, but I think we need to lovingly convey to them that this spiritual community here is not as strong when they are not present. We need to show them we love them and that we do want them here and that we want to have all of us on board in this process of rebuilding. And so I think the first thing we need to prepare ourselves for is that not everyone will be back when our doors first open. But I think a second observation, a second principle that we need to prepare ourselves for, we need to be prepared that things will look differently in some ways when we come back. Now, what does that mean? I don't know. I don't know exactly what that means. I cannot tell you what things specifically will be different, but I just don't think that a society can go through what we've been going through and not be impacted, not have some sort of long-term impacts. And I think a great parallel to this, for those of you that can think back and remember what it was like to fly on an airplane on September 10th, 2001, compared to September 12th. And think about what it's like to go fly on an airplane now, nearly 20 years after the fact. It's still different. Things have been impacted seemingly permanently by those events, by that crisis of that time. So when our church doors open again, understand that there may be some things that look a little different. Some of the procedures may have to change, and that may be temporary. Hopefully they will be temporary. Some of them may be more long-term. We just don't know. And what that means then, church, is that we're going to have to be patient with one another. I know it's hard to ask you to be more patient, because if you're like me and like every other parent on the face of the planet, like every other person who has been cooped up for nearly 3 months now, our patience is running thin. I know, believe me. But we're going to need to dig down and find more. We're going to have to be patient with one another. We're going to have to be patient with our leadership as we are all trying to figure out how to navigate these waters. We need to lean upon our faith that God will bless the decisions and the directions that are made and the directions that are taken. And what we need to do is we need to turn the results over to Him. Trust that He is going to help us get through this. and get through all the uncertainty and all the changes that may be coming down the road. Now, I say this, and as I give you these thoughts, I understand these applications are less than exciting. To be quite honest, I don't particularly like making them. But I do think they are things that we need to face. I think they are things that we need to glean from the experiences of God's past people and prepare ourselves for them. But even as I acknowledge that they are not exactly the most encouraging observations, let me give you a couple of more things to perhaps gain strength from as we consider all of these thoughts. First of all, when Israel returned from exile, one thing that was still certain is that they were still God's people and they still had His word. That fact, those facts had not changed. And as they entered that rebuilding phase, what that provided for them was an opportunity to draw strength from the fact that they were still God's people. They could draw strength in their commitment to follow His word. As we enter our rebuilding phase, no matter what we face, we are still God's people. And we still have His word. Methods and culture may need to be adjusted, but our identity does not. And our foundation does not change. Additionally, I would say that reading through Ezra and Nehemiah, as Israel rebuilt after exile, one of the things that they figured out is that they needed every hand on that wall. When Nehemiah starts the process, gets people back to doing all this, they needed every person to contribute to that process. This was not a time for overly individualistic thinking when they were trying to rebuild. If they were going to do this, they were going to do it together. Nobody could sit this one out. And I think that's the same for us. As we enter our rebuilding phase, we are going to need every hand on the wall. This will not be a time for overly individualistic thinking, but a time in which we band together as the Christ community that we are, working side by side, going through the rough times and the good times, and working side by side. I promise you, we will bounce back from this as God empowers us day after day. It won't be easy. Let's not give ourselves any false impressions. It's not going to be easy. There are going to be struggles along the way, but it is going to be fulfilling. And it's going to be something that is going to bind us together in relationships and in partnership that is going to last for a very, very long time. I look forward personally to being a part of that work with you. And I hope that you are looking forward to it. And I hope that you are committed to do whatever it takes to help this community here at Bear Valley rebuild as we come back together soon. Thank you for sharing this time with us today. Please hang on for just another moment for a message from our shepherds.